Hello, I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Welcome to First Five Now, a Freedom Forum conversation series exploring the complex questions our First Amendment freedoms face today, and featuring current newsmakers who put their freedoms into practice. According to the Freedom Forum's landmark survey, The First Amendment, Where America Stands, freedom of speech is the best known of the 5 First Amendment freedoms. Yet support for free speech faces increasingly complex and urgent tests revolving around hostile and hateful expression, and if and how it should be moderated. Today, we'll explore the long history of free expression with Jacob Mchangama, author of the new book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. The book provides a definitive account of free speech from the ancient word to the digital age, and explains how the free exchange of challenging ideas is essential for democratic nations and why defending it is so critical today. This program is brought to you by the Freedom Forum, which is continuing its year-long celebration of its 30th anniversary after its founding on July 4th, 1991, by my father, Al Newharth. Since then, the Freedom Forum has fostered First Amendment freedoms for all. Our vision is an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And now, here's what a cross-section of Americans from our survey say about freedom of speech.
I think we can agree to disagree.
Hate speech needs to have limitations.
Conservative voices get censored, liberal voices don't.
All the freedoms in the First Amendment ride on having the ability to speak our minds and to voice our opinions freely.
If we don't speak up, we'll be overlooked. And things won't ever change.
I need to be able to express myself during a pride parade, during a job interview, for health care.
Freedom of speech is more than just speech. It encompasses the freedom of expression as well.
You can talk amicably or agree to disagree, but when it becomes violent and harassing, then that's where the boundaries need to be drawn.
I don't like some of the speech that is considered to be free.
I don't think hate speech should necessarily be protected, but people should still have freedom of speech.
People have hated people for years and years. Heck, if you were at Salem and you didn't like somebody, you call them a witch, and next thing you know, they're being dunked in a river.
People get offended for many different things. You never know.
Those are just a few of the voices we heard from the more than 3,000 Americans who took part in our survey, which revealed that Americans' views of the First Amendment are as diverse and divided as the country itself. One big revelation: the First Amendment remains valued and vital for nearly all Americans. And now, please welcome our moderator, John Maynard.
Thank you, Jan, and welcome to First Five Now. I'm John Maynard, Senior Director of Programs for the Freedom Forum. As Jan said, and as you heard from just some of the participants in our First Amendment survey, free speech is the best known of the First Amendment freedoms, yet there are still divisions over just how far those free speech rights should be extended. It's a debate that goes back to the ancient world, and today we'll talk to an author who provides a definitive account of this transformative idea, and in the process establishes why defending free speech is so critical today. Jacob Mchangama is the author of the new book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, which we'll discuss today. Jacob is the founder and executive director of the Danish think tank Justitia, and the host of the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. His writing on free speech has appeared in The Economist, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and many other outlets around the world. Jacob Mchangama, welcome to First Five Now.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here.
So let's start with what inspired you to write this book, which really provides such a sweeping history of free speech around the world?
Well, as I'm sure you know, a Danish newspaper in 2005 published some cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and that kicked off sort of a major controversy over the relationship between free speech and religion that really sparked my obsession with the idea, practice, and history of free speech. So I've been investigating this principle ever since. And given how charged many debates about this freedom are today, I also thought that investigating the development of free speech through the prism of history might help provide an answer to if and why this freedom is as important as its defenders like to claim, and what really is at stake when this right is secured or disregarded, respectively. And I also think, when you discuss the history of free speech controversies, you might develop a more cool and detached attitude to current controversies that could otherwise warp your perspective through, the biases and emotions that we're all vulnerable to be hijacked by.
Could you give us remind us about that cartoon affair that in your home country of Denmark?
Yeah, so it was a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten, and prior to that, there'd been certain incidents where you could say Islamists had sort of threatened people who were thought to blaspheme against Islam, and most notoriously, a Dutch filmmaker had been killed on the streets of Amsterdam. So this Danish editor wanted to test whether there was indeed an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship, and then he published an essay arguing for sort of Enlightenment values like free speech and tolerance, and saying that Muslims should be, treated like everyone else. They should have free speech, but that also entailed, the obligation to have to suffer when your ideas and most sacred values are being attacked verbally. And unfortunately, that led to numerous threats, international boycotts, and even, internationally, the attack on the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo would not have happened without the cartoons, because one of the main reasons why Charlie Hebdo was attacked was because they republished as one of few newspapers the cartoons in solidarity with Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten. But that also sort of kicked off a debate in sort of cozy liberal secular Denmark, where we took free speech for granted, and where we thought that there was no danger in poking fun at religion, because that sort of debate and that fight had been settled centuries ago, and that's really what got me thinking about free speech, and ever since, more and more controversies have popped up ever since. And of course, now we live in the digital age with social media that has given rise to new controversies. So I think it's really a crucial principle to navigate in the world that we live in, and especially if you live in democracies committed to both freedom and equality.
Right. And I want to go back, because you kind of touched on this in your first answer, but could you really expand on the importance of looking back at history of free speech and relating that to present day, and the many complex issues that arise over the issue?
Yeah, but I think, I think it's really, it helps you develop a more cool and detached attitude to current controversies when you reflect on them through the prism of history that could otherwise warp your perspective through the biases and emotions that we are all vulnerable to be hijacked by. But it can also sort of say, today one of the big issues in the U.S. is the free speech and racial justice, for instance. So how should we think about that? Well, how about looking at what was the relationship between free speech, censorship, and repression during slavery, during Jim Crow, and so on. And they, those periods of time might not provide perfect answers to today's dilemmas, but I think they can certainly help us understand better what's at stake, and maybe help us avoid some tempting pitfalls, because I think all human beings are prone to intolerance, and we're very good at convincing ourselves that free speech is important, but on this specific issue, we need to have an exception. And looking at free speech through history, you can sort of appreciate the dangers of these exceptions and see how they have been used for all kinds of things that most modern people today would say were completely unacceptable.
You write in the book and, that free speech has, of course, very ancient roots. Where and when would you approximate the birth of free speech?
So I would argue that the Athenian democracy is the first polity in recorded history where free speech is sort of a fundamental constitutional, didn't have a written constitution, but and cultural value that was deeply ingrained in that city-state's commitment to egalitarian democracy, and with some very important caveats, of course. So in Pericles' famous funeral oration, as recounted by Thucydides, he says that our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. And he also says that we are free and tolerant in our private lives, and that we Athenians take our decisions on policy or submit them to proper discussion. The worst thing is to rush into action before the consequences have been properly debated. And in Athens, you had these two overlapping principles of free speech. So you had isegoria, which means something like equality of speech, that was exercised in the popular assembly, where all freeborn male citizens could raise their voice and discuss and vote on laws. And then you had the principle of parousia, which means something like uninhibited or fearless speech that permeated Athenian culture, which allowed, until it didn't allow it anymore, Socrates to sort of roast prominent Athenians, and also Plato and Aristotle to set up sort of academies and philosophize in ways and advances that were really at odds with the Athenian democracy. So you have the famous orator Demosthenes, who said that in Athens you could praise the Spartan constitution and criticize the Athenian constitution, but in Sparta, which was not a democracy, you were only allowed to praise the Spartan constitution. So, and I think that today is still really the litmus test of free speech. You know, whether you're permitted to criticize your own government, your own system of governance.
Yeah, that was kind of going to go to my next question. What connections can you make from the Athenian times to what we're looking at today with free speech?
Yeah, for a long time, the Athenian democracy was really not was looked down upon. So many Enlightenment thinkers look more to the Roman Republic, where you had more of an elitist free speech conception that is in sort of permanent tension with the egalitarian conception. I think one of the geniuses of James Madison, the architect of the First Amendment, is that he saw very clearly the dangers of mob rule in the Athenian democracy, but at the same time, he was very clear that the First Amendment needed to protect everyone, and unlike the British model of elitist free speech, where you had seditious libel laws, and that sort of limited what the lower classes were allowed to say. He says this very prominently in the report of 1800, which criticizes the Sedition Act. But then at the same time, he realized that you need checks and balances, so you don't have a trial against Socrates play out in modern republics. You need a Bill of Rights to, even though he was initially critical of a Bill of Rights, he came around to the opposite idea. So I would say that Madison sort of fuses the Athenian egalitarian free speech ideal with some very needed updates that remedied, or at least tried to remedy, some of the most flagrant flaws in the Athenian model that had basically cost Socrates his life when he sort of crossed a democratic majority in Athens.
So the subtitle of the book is "From Socrates: A History from Socrates to Social Media." So, if you don't mind, let's jump way ahead to social media. And it's a big part of your book, obviously. And you do pose two big questions at the top of your last chapter. And those are, what are the limits of online free speech and who decides them? Those are big questions for sure, and I
Yeah.
encourage people to read the book for your insights and from the experts that you speak of. But how would you approach both of those questions?
Well, sort of in the first sort of techno-utopian civil libertarian days of the internet, the question to those the answer to those questions would be none and yourself.
Right.
So that was sort of the idea of a completely decentralized internet where there was no authority. You had the famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. That sort of
so
was
in other
the
words.
ethos of.
In other words, no limits on online free speech, and you decide. That's
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
And
right.
you know, no government or corporate entity could sort of decide the limits. That relatively quickly turned out. Well, you could say sort of the in the U.S. there was Congress gave backing to this with the CDA Section 230 that sort of was based on this ideal of internet exceptionalism along with strong First Amendment protections. But as the internet became more centralized with big centralized platforms whose content moderation decisions impacted millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of people across the world, the civil libertarian ideal came under pressure both from these corporate behemoths that sort of did content moderation without representation, but also from a number of governments who said, we're not going to let Facebook or YouTube or whichever platform allow users to spread all kinds of ideas that run contrary to our laws or that can undermine the government. And so, for more than a decade, internet freedom has really been in decline. And unfortunately, one of the drivers of this development is European democracies who have adopted laws, most notably Germany, that obliges major platforms to remove illegal content within 24 hours or risk hefty fines. And that means that basically laws adopted in Brussels or in Berlin are sort of become the model for content moderation decisions and frameworks for big global platforms, and that can be problematic. But we also see that a number of authoritarian and illiberal states copy pastes these European laws. They do it in bad faith because in Germany, you have rule of law protections. You have a constitution that protects free speech with big caveats. But in Russia, in Venezuela, in Turkey, you don't have those protections. But they can still point to the German president and say, "Well, we're just doing the same thing that European democracies are doing." And so I think that's a big problem. The difficult question is, how do you solve this? And I don't think anyone has a perfect solution. I think looking back at history of free speech, I would argue that in general, free speech thrives best when you have decentralized authority over the sharing of information and opinion. So I would like to see a more decentralized social media environment. How to go about that, I don't know. Some will point to blockchain technology. One way to do it perhaps could be to have your Facebook, your YouTube, and others allow users or to adopt these filters, so that users themselves decide more about what kind of content do you want to be confronted with, rather than centralized decisions about these things. These should obviously be easy to use because few of us have the time or expertise to sort of sit and develop these filters ourselves. But you could have, if the Anti-Defamation League has a very broad definition of anti-Semitism, it could develop a filter that you could toggle on and off, and that would be more extensive than what follows under certainly under the First Amendment, but even sort of hate speech laws in Europe, and then you could filter those kind of things, but that would not affect others who were not so sensitive to a broader definition of anti-Semitism. So that would be one way to create a more healthy online environment for free speech.
Our First Amendment survey shows that most Americans know that the First Amendment protects hate speech, but they are divided on whether it should. More than a third say preventing hate speech is more important than preserving free speech, while 35% prioritize free speech. I'm curious on your reaction to those statistics and where you come down on protecting hate speech.
And I think, if you look even closer at the demographics, I think that younger Americans and those who are more liberal tend to be less tolerant of racist speech. And you see a development there with, that de-emphasizes the role of free speech on such issues. And I understand the impulse, the temptation of banning hate speech. The standard set out in decisions like Brandenburg versus Ohio is really, really high. So I understand the temptation. You're in a country that is concerned with both freedom, equality, and dignity, and with a not so distant past that entrenched white supremacy and made a mockery out of its founding principles. But my reading of American history is that the values of free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. And I think no one has said it better than the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who himself was born as a slave and who insisted that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And I think a good example is the laws in the antebellum South. And Virginia is my favorite example because, as you know better than anyone, Virginia was the first state to adopt a Declaration of Rights in June 1776, even preceding the Declaration of Independence, and that protected press freedom. But in 1835 or 1836, Virginia adopted this sweeping law that banned the printing, publication, and circulation of abolitionist literature, basically banning the idea, you could not say that whites did not have a right to title of property in their colored slaves. That was Virginia was far from the only states. You had some southern states that adopted formally death penalty for abolitionist literature. On the other hand, you had people like Frederick Douglass and abolitionists who used the principle and practice of free speech to counter slavery. And of course, censorship and suppression was also part and parcel of Jim Crow, whereas the civil rights movement depended and expanded First Amendment protection. So, from I guess 1958 into the 1960s, a number of sort of landmark First Amendment decisions were won by the NAACP and others that really expanded First Amendment protections. So in my reading of American history, free speech has very much been a friend of minorities, and I think the late Congressman John Lewis often said something along the lines that without free speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird, like a bird without wings. And I think more broadly, the history of free speech, I think free speech really is perhaps the most powerful engine of human equality ever invented by humankind, and really has been instrumental for the fight for equal rights and justice for just about every minority and oppressed group in human history.
Yeah.
And just if I may, I think that once minorities start demanding that free speech be restricted, I think they play a dangerous game, because no one is ever more than a majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of laws against hatred and offense.
Right. Two of the freedoms of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, have been intertwined throughout history. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us some of the key moments, where the fight for freedom of speech and religion sort of went hand in hand.
Yeah, it's a very good and very complicated question, because the relationship between free speech and religion is a bit like a seesaw going up and down. Right. But if we fast forward to the early modern era, then of course the Reformation kicks off a very disruptive and bloody period of European history, but also one that provokes a lot of thinking about if and how people of different faiths can live together in peace. I think sort of the earliest sort of real constitutional arrangements securing religious freedom we actually find in Central Europe in the Principality of Transylvania with the Edict of Torder from 1568, which ensured preachers of various Christian denominations, and this included anti-Trinitarians who were otherwise viciously persecuted around Europe, the right to preach without being punished. And it was then expanded shortly after to really extend an individual right to freedom of religion, which was completely different to what was going on in Western Europe, where basically the settlement between Protestants and Catholic was that, if your ruler was Catholic, the subjects also had to be Catholics, and vice versa with Protestants. If we take colonial America, then the Puritans were obviously famously intolerant, and in New England in particular, there were quite barbarous punishments for blasphemy and heresy. But there were also colonists like William Penn and Roger Williams, who founded Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, respectively, where extensive religious freedom was granted, and which obviously expanded free speech in the sphere of religion and was sort of included in charters. But I think it's also important to note that neither Pennsylvania nor Rhode Island sort of instituted complete free speech. So Pennsylvania, for instance, punished blasphemy and what we today might call religious hate speech. They also had pre-publication censorship and punished scandalous and malicious defamers and spreaders of false news. And William Penn even presided over the punishment of someone who had said something seditious and was punished with whipping. Some of the same things you saw in Rhode Island. So on the one hand, these freedoms have gone hand in hand, but they've also been in tension. And of course, you still see that in certain countries around the world, that these different freedoms can be in tension. So that is sort of a short answer to a very complicated question.
Absolutely. We'll end on, I want to get your views on some issues surrounding free speech which concern you the most. When you take a worldwide view of the issue, where are the hot spots? Where is freedom of speech most endangered, if at all?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good question. I think if you look sort of if you take a long-term view, then we're living in a golden age where some of the early champions of free speech would marvel at what it's possible to say with no looming inquisition or the like. But if you take a short-term view, I think that the golden age is coming to an end. I think we're in a free speech recession, which is being fueled partly by authoritarianism around the world, but also by liberal democracies sort of compromising free speech, both legally with increasingly restrictive laws, but also culturally. And I think ultimately free speech depends on a broad acceptance of the culture of free speech, which is why it's so great that you conduct this survey of attitudes towards free speech, because that's really where you detect in which direction things are going. Because if Americans ultimately become indifferent to the First Amendment, then chances are that the legal protection of the First Amendment is going to be significantly reduced when new generations occupy the bench at the Supreme Court. So I think really it's a global phenomenon, but I'm actually most concerned about the willingness of democracies not to stand up for free speech and to view free speech increasingly as a threat towards democracy rather than the foundation for democracy. And I think that helps pave the way for authoritarians to rush in and take advantage of that. And I think, if you look at the history, I don't think democracies have a very good record of protecting democracies through restrictions on free speech. I think we have many examples where we look back on, it could be It could be anti-communist laws in the United States in the 20th century. It could be, perhaps more controversially, might take the laws that the Weimar Republic tried to stem communism and Nazism unsuccessfully, and that were used by the Nazis when they came into power to ensure their own power. So I think we have to have more faith in free speech, even though it's a counterintuitive principle, and even though it goes against our intuition when we're confronted with hatred and disinformation and people whose ideas seem threatening to the order of things. But if our faith in this principle sort of erodes, then I think it's a freedom standing on clay feet.
That's well said. Well, the book is Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, the author, Jacob Mchangama. Thank you so much. The book is out this week, and we thank you for all your valuable insights and for joining us today on First Five Now.
Thank you so much, John. It was a real pleasure.
And to all our viewers, we hope you'll share your thoughts about today's program via social media at the addresses listed below. And the Freedom Forum will be posting a recording of this program on the Freedom Forum YouTube page, where you can post comments. I'm John Maynard. Thank you for joining us today.